The auction hall was loud. It was always loud on Korath 9. The station sat at the edge of 3 star systems, and on any given day, ships from 100 different worlds were docked along its massive outer ring. Traders, warlords, engineers, and collectors all came here for one reason. They came to buy and sell the things that the rest of the galaxy had given up on. The Vethnar Galactic Exchange was the biggest salvage auction in known space. It had been running for over 200 years. In that time, it had sold dead warships, broken cargo haulers, alien ruins, and even the bones of creatures so large that their skeletons had to be auctioned in pieces. If something had been lost, forgotten, or abandoned, it ended up here eventually. Today, the crowd was bigger than usual. Word had gotten out about Lot 47. The auctioneer was a tall, thin creature called a Ven. He had 4 arms, pale green skin, and a voice that could carry across a crowded room without him ever raising it. He stood at the front of the hall on a raised platform, tapping his upper fingers together as the crowd filled in below him. He looked nervous. That was unusual. The Ven almost never looked nervous. The reason for his nerves was floating in the docking bay just outside the hall's wide observation window. It was a ship, but calling it a ship felt too simple. It was the largest thing currently docked at Korath 9, and it looked nothing like the clean, modern vessels parked around it. It was dark. Not just painted dark, but dark in a way that seemed to pull light toward it and swallow it. The hull was covered in plates that looked almost like scales, each one slightly different in shape, layered over each other in a way that reminded people of skin rather than metal. Long, curved structures ran along its sides like the bones of some enormous creature. There were no visible windows, no lights, no markings of any known current civilization. It was a Dravhari ship, and the Dravhari had been gone for 300 years. The Dravhari had been one of the most advanced civilizations the galaxy had ever seen. They had not built their ships the way other species did. They had grown them. Each vessel was part machine and part living organism, shaped over decades using a combination of engineering and biology that no other species had ever fully understood. When the Dravhari disappeared, wiped out in a war that most historians still argued about, their ships had scattered across the galaxy. Some had been found drifting. Some had been captured and studied. Most had been destroyed because no one could figure out how to control them. This one had been found 3 years ago, floating near a dead star on the far edge of the outer territories. A salvage crew had dragged it back using cables because no one could get inside to fly it. They had tried everything. The ship had killed 2 drones on the first day. On the second day, it had fired a directed energy pulse through the hull of the salvage vessel. Not enough to destroy it, but enough to make the crew very certain they did not want to try again. It had been sitting in a secure docking bay at Korath 9 ever since, classified as Hazard Tier Omega by the Galactic Salvage Board. Tier Omega meant one thing: too dangerous to use, too dangerous to move, recommended for controlled demolition. The only reason it was being auctioned at all was because the board had decided that destroying it would be more expensive than selling it, even at a very low price. If no one bought it today, the demolition order would go through by the end of the week. The auctioneer called the hall to order and began his presentation. He described the ship's dimensions. He described its estimated age. He described the 3 failed boarding attempts and the injuries that had resulted. He described the Galactic Salvage Board's official findings in careful, neutral language. He was very professional about all of it. Then he opened bidding at the reserve price, which was so low it was almost insulting for a ship of that size, and waited. The hall was quiet. The crowd was large, but no one moved. Fleet captains, who had been eager and loud all morning, stood with their arms folded. A Thrune warlord near the front, broad and heavily armored, stared at the ship through the observation window with an expression that was hard to read. A group of Velhari engineers whispered to each other and shook their heads. A pair of Keth merchants turned and walked toward the exit before the auctioneer had even finished speaking. No one raised a paddle. The auctioneer waited. He tapped his fingers. He looked out at the crowd. He cleared his throat, which was not a sound a Ven usually made in public. Still nothing. Then, from the far back of the hall, a hand went up. It was a human hand. That alone was enough to make the people standing nearby turn and look. Humans were not uncommon at Korath 9. But they were not common either. They were a newer species in galactic terms, still finding their place, still learning which rooms they were welcome in and which ones they were tolerated in. Most of the galaxy regarded them as interesting but unremarkable. Energetic, difficult to predict, prone to doing things that made no sense to anyone else. The human standing at the back of the hall was young. He looked to be in his mid-20s. He was not tall, not broad, and not wearing anything that suggested wealth or status. His coat was dark and worn at the elbows, covered in small stains that were probably various kinds of machine oil. He had a bag over one shoulder with tools sticking out of the top. His hair was a mess. He had the kind of face that looked like it was used to being told no. His name was Kale Morrow. He was 24 years old, originally from a human colony called Heron's Reach that no longer existed. He had been working as a freelance repair technician on Korath 9 for the past 2 years, taking whatever jobs came his way. He was not famous. He had no fleet, no crew, no backing from any government or corporation. He had, to his name, a toolkit, a small rented room on the station's lower deck, and exactly enough credits to meet the reserve price on Lot 47. He had spent every last one of them. The auctioneer looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the rest of the crowd, as if giving them one final chance. No one else moved. He looked back at Kale. He confirmed the bid. His voice was completely flat when he said it, the way a voice goes flat when the speaker is trying very hard not to show what he is feeling. Sold. The crowd reacted, not with applause, with noise. Some of it was laughter, the kind that was not entirely unkind, but not entirely kind either. Some of it was murmuring, people leaning toward each other and speaking in low voices. The Thrune warlord near the front turned to look at Kale with an expression that was no longer hard to read. It was cold, calculating, unhappy. Kale did not notice, or if he did not show it. He was already looking at the ship through the observation window. He had been looking at it, really looking at it, for the past 10 minutes. He had not been studying it the way the engineers had, checking for threats and weaknesses. He had been looking at it the way a person looks at something they recognize. He picked up his bag, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked toward the docking bay. Behind him, a senior Velhari officer, who had been standing quietly near the wall, watched him go. The old officer had fought in 3 wars, and had seen more ships than he could count. He watched the young human walk toward the most dangerous vessel in the station, with nothing but a toolkit and a worn-out coat. And he said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, he said to the officer standing beside him, "I want to know who that boy is." The docking bay assigned to Kale was on the outer ring of Korath 9, far from the main commercial berths. It was the kind of area the station used for things it wanted to keep away from everything else. The lighting was poor. The floor was stained. The bay was large enough to hold the Dravhari ship with room to spare, but it felt small anyway because the ship seemed to take up more space than its actual size should have allowed. Kale stood at the entrance to the bay and looked at it for a while without moving. It was bigger up close. The hull plating up close was detailed in ways that were hard to see from the auction hall window. The scale-like plates had faint patterns on them, lines and curves that did not seem decorative. They looked more like something that had grown that way naturally, the way wood has grain, the way bone has texture. There was no rust, no obvious damage, for a ship that had been floating near a dead star for an unknown number of years before being found. It was in remarkable condition. Kale sat down on a crate near the bay entrance. He opened his bag, pulled out a wrapped piece of food, and started eating. He did not approach the ship. He did not take out any tools. He just sat there and ate, and looked at the ship, and occasionally said something out loud. "I know you killed the drones," he said. "I don't blame you. I'd be annoyed too if strangers kept sending machines at me." The ship did not respond. The hull did not move. The lights along the bay ceiling flickered once, which had nothing to do with the ship and everything to do with the fact that the outer ring's electrical systems were old and poorly maintained. Kale kept eating. He kept talking. He talked about the hull plating, and how the layering pattern on the lower port side suggested the armor was self-repairing, at least in theory. Though whatever process powered the repair had probably slowed down significantly without regular maintenance. He talked about the sensor arrays he could see mounted along the ship's upper structure, and how 3 of them were sitting at the wrong angle, which would create blind spots in its detection field. He talked about a coolant line near the rear of the ship that was clearly leaking, leaving a slow dark stain on the bay floor beneath it. He talked like someone reading a book out loud to themselves, calm, not performing, not trying to impress, just thinking through what he saw. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time he sat on the crate and talked. Each time the ship gave him nothing back. But it also did not fire on him. It did not flood the bay with gas. It did not do any of the things it had done to everyone else who had come near it. On the 4th day, Cale brought his tools. He went to the coolant leak first, because it was the most obvious problem, and because fixing it did not require him to touch anything that might be considered a sensitive system. He worked slowly, narrating as he went. The fitting here is cracked, not broken. I'm going to put a temporary wrap on it today and see if I can find the right replacement part tomorrow. I'm not going to touch anything else nearby. Just this. He fixed the fitting. He stepped back. Nothing happened. He packed his tools, said goodnight to the ship, and left. By the end of the 2nd week, he had replaced 3 cracked sensor array mounts, patched 2 sections of outer hull where small fractures had formed, and cleared a blocked vent on the underside of the ship that had been forcing one of the engine-adjacent cooling systems to work harder than it should have been. Each repair was small. Each one he announced before he started, and described as he worked. The other workers on the outer ring thought he had lost his mind. A few stopped to watch from a safe distance, expecting at any moment for the ship to do something violent. It never did. That, in its own way, was more unsettling than if it had. On the 17th day, while Cale was sitting on his crate eating his evening meal and reading through a section of Dravhari schematics on a battered data tablet, something changed. A door opened. Not the main boarding ramp. A smaller access hatch, low on the ship's port side, about 20 meters from where Cale was sitting. It slid open slowly, without sound, and stopped. No light came from inside. No sound. It simply waited. Cale looked at it for a long time. He finished eating. He folded the wrapper carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He picked up his toolkit and his light, walked to the open hatch, and stepped inside. The interior of the ship was dark and warm. The air smelled strange, not unpleasant, more like deep soil and something faintly electrical. The walls were not flat. They curved and layered in the same way the outer hull did, and the material felt different depending on where he touched it. Some sections were hard and dense. Others had a very slight give to them, like pressing on something that was not quite solid. Cale turned on his light and walked slowly. He did not go far. He found a section of corridor that looked like a maintenance access passage and sat down on the floor with his tablet, pulling up the internal schematics he had spent 3 years collecting from black market archives and academic databases. He matched what he could see with what was on the diagrams. He made notes. He stayed for about 2 hours, then walked back out and left. He came back the next morning. The hatch was still open. Over the following days, Cale worked his way deeper into the ship, one section at a time, never rushing, always talking. He found the main power distribution hub and identified 3 nodes that had gone dormant and could be safely restarted. He found a water reclamation system that had partially clogged and cleared it. He found a section of the ship that he could not identify from any of his schematics. A large, circular room near the ship's center, with walls that were different from the rest. They were smoother, and they pulsed with a faint, slow rhythm that he could feel in his hand when he pressed it against them. He sat in that room for a long time. He did not try to repair anything there. He was not sure it needed repairing. "You've been alone for a long time," he said, to the room, to the ship, to whatever was listening. "That's hard. I know what that's like." The lights in the corridor outside the room came on. Just dim. Just the first hint of light after weeks of darkness. But they came on. Cale stood up slowly. He looked at the lights. Then he looked at the walls around him and nodded once, the way a person nods when something confirms what they already suspected. He went back to the outer ring that evening and found the old Velhari admiral waiting near his bay entrance. The admiral's name was Sorveth, and he had, as promised, found out who Kale was. He had read the file. He knew about Heron's Reach. He knew what had happened to the colony and when. He knew the boy had been 9 years old. Sorveth looked at Kale for a moment, and then looked past him at the ship, where faint light was now visible through the open hatch. "The salvage board is going to hear about those lights," the old admiral said quietly. "I know," Kale said. "They'll come asking questions." "I know that too." Sorveth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not fixing a ship." Kale looked at him. "No," he said, "I'm not." He picked up his bag and went back inside. The news spread the way news always spreads, on a busy station. Quietly at first. Then, all at once. People had been watching Kale from a distance for weeks, and when the lights inside the Dravhari ship came on, it stopped being a curiosity and started being something else. Station workers talked about it during meal breaks. Traders passing through asked questions at the docking registry. Someone posted a short visual recording on the open network showing the faint glow coming from the ship's open hatch, and within a day, it had been shared across 4 star systems. The title of the post was, "Human Boy Lives Inside Death Ship." Day 22. It was meant to be funny. It was not entirely funny. 3 days after the lights came on, a shuttle arrived from the Galactic salvage board. It carried 2 officials and a legal representative, and they came to Kale's Bay with a printed repossession order and expressions that suggested they had been preparing for this conversation for some time. The lead official was a Ven, like the auctioneer, but older and less polite. His name was on the order as Director Haas, and he explained, in careful and measured language, that the GSV Null had been sold under a conditional auction clause that allowed the board to reclaim any hazard tier Omega vessel if the new owner failed to demonstrate safe and lawful containment within 30 standard days. It had been 22 days. They were early. Kale listened to all of it standing just outside the ship's open hatch, arms folded, looking at the officials the way a person looks at rain. Not angry, not worried, just patient. When Director Haas finished speaking, Kale said, "The coolant leak is fixed. The 3 dormant power nodes are back online. The sensor arrays are recalibrated. The ship is not a containment problem. It hasn't fired on anyone. It hasn't damaged the station. By the board's own definition, a vessel is considered safely contained if it poses no active threat to surrounding infrastructure or personnel." Director Haas blinked. The legal representative made a note. "Be that as it may," Haas said, "the vessel's hazard tier classification has not been revised, and until it is..." The ship's access hatch slid closed. Not violently. Not with any noise. It simply closed, smooth and silent, as though it had been waiting for the right moment. All 3 of the officials took a step back. The legal representative dropped her notes. Kale did not move. "The board's repossession order requires physical access to the vessel," he said. "If you'd like to board it, you're welcome to try." They left. Kale watched them go, then turned back to the closed hatch and said quietly, "Thank you." After a moment, the hatch opened again. He went inside. The problem was that Director Haas and the board were not the only ones with an interest in the ship. The warlord who had been watching from the front of the auction hall, Grak Velsorath of the Thruin Dominion, had not come to Korith, 9, to buy the ship. He had come to make sure it was destroyed. The Thruin were a powerful species, militarily advanced and deeply political. They maintained their power in the outer territories through a careful balance of force and control over weapons technology. The Dravhari, before their disappearance, had developed weapon systems that still had no equivalent in the modern galaxy. A restored Dravhari warship would not simply be a powerful vessel. It would be a disruption. It would shift what was possible. Grak had spent a significant amount of money ensuring the demolition order would go through. He had paid the right people, filed the right paperwork, and arrived at Korith, 9, personally, to confirm the outcome. Then a young human with no name and no backing had bought the ship for almost nothing, walked inside it, and started turning the lights on. Grak sent agents that same week. Not to confront Kale directly, just to watch. Then, to begin small acts of interference. A delivery of replacement parts Kale had ordered was rerouted and marked as lost. The station's maintenance crew responsible for the outer ring bay suddenly found reasons to report noise complaints about Kale's work schedule. Someone filed a structural concern report about the bay floor that triggered an inspection and forced a 2-day work stoppage. Kale dealt with each problem steadily and without making noise about it. He found new sources for his parts. He adjusted his schedule. He passed the inspection. He was not entirely focused on the outside problems, because inside the ship, something much more significant was happening. He had been spending more and more time in the circular room near the ship's center. He had brought a proper light source in, and a cushion to sit on, and his data tablet, and several evenings' worth of food. He had stopped trying to cross-reference the room against his schematics, because the room was simply not in any of them. Whatever it was, the Dravhari had not documented it in any archive that had survived. The walls of the room pulsed. Slowly, steadily, like breathing. Kale had started to notice that when he talked in this room, the pulse changed slightly. When he described a repair he was planning, it slowed. When he talked about something personal, it quickened. He had tested it several times to make sure he was not imagining it. He was not imagining it. He sat in the room on a night when the station's outer ring was particularly quiet, the kind of quiet that only came in the very early hours, and he said what he had been building toward for several days. "I've been reading everything I can find about the Dravhari for 3 years," he said. "Before I came here. Back when I was just collecting their schematics because they were the most interesting engineering I'd ever seen. And there's something in the older texts, the ones most people ignore because they're not technical. They're more like histories. They talk about the ships differently than we do. They don't say, the ship was built, or the ship was designed. They say things like, the ship was given, or the ship remembered. As if the ship was something that had already existed. And the Dravhari just helped it become itself. The pulse in the walls slowed to something very steady and even. I think the crew didn't just die when the Dravhari fell," Kale said. "I think some of them went into the ship. I think that's what you are. I think you're what's left of them." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the walls, in the floor, in the air of the room itself, a sound came. It was not a voice. Not exactly. It was something that a voice would become if a voice had been sleeping for 3 centuries. It was rough and fragmented and enormous, like hearing a mountain try to speak. But it formed a word. A single word, translated by the ship's own systems into something Kale's translator could process. Remembered. Kale sat very still. His heart was going fast. He kept his voice steady. "Can you tell me your name?" he said. Another long silence. The pulse in the walls changed again, cycling through something, searching through something. The way a person searches through an old box, for something they have not held in a very long time. Then the sound came again. Slower this time, more careful. "Null. That remains." Kale let out a slow breath. He nodded. He looked at the walls around him, the curved and layered surfaces that breathed with a rhythm of their own. "I'm Kale," he said. "I'm going to keep coming back. If that's all right with you." The room grew slightly warmer. The lighting in the corridor outside brightened by a fraction. In the docking bay below, the ship's outer running lights came on for the first time. Dim, but on. "Null. That remains," asked its question then. The words were still rough, still formed from something that had been silent for too long. But they were clear. "Will you stay?" Kale did not answer immediately. He thought about Heron's reach. He thought about what it meant to answer that question honestly. Then he said, "Yes." Grak Velsorath was not a patient creature by nature, but he was a careful one. He had not survived as long as he had by acting without planning. He had watched the situation at the outer ring berth develop for weeks, and he had made decisions at every step based on what was most likely to succeed with the least amount of attention. The small interference had not worked. The parts delays, the inspections, the noise complaints had done nothing except slow the human down for a few days. The ship was getting more active, not less. The lights were on more often now. Station workers reported sounds coming from inside the vessel during late hours, not threatening sounds, but sounds. Like a building learning to breathe again. Grack made a different decision. He had 3 agents on the station. They were not Thruin. He never used Thruin directly for this kind of work. They were freelancers, hired for specific tasks, experienced in the kind of work that did not leave clear records. He met with them in a private room near the upper commercial district and gave them a precise set of instructions. 4 EMP charges placed along the ship's outer hull, a signal jammer covering the outer ring's communication band so the human could not call for help, a secondary explosive device placed at the bay's power coupling to cut the berth's connection to the station grid, eliminating the possibility of the ship drawing power from external sources. The whole operation to be carried out after the 3rd station night shift change, when the outer ring was at its quietest. Grack would be watching from a private shuttle docked on the upper ring, far enough away to be credible if questions were asked later. He was not worried about questions. By the time questions were asked, the ship would be slag, and the human would either be safely away from the blast radius or not. That part was not his concern. The agents went to work. They were good at what they did. They moved through the outer ring without drawing attention, dressed as maintenance crew with falsified station ID tags. The jammer was placed first, a small device tucked behind a conduit panel in the ring corridor, activated remotely. The power coupling explosive went in next, attached to the underside of the bay's main grid connection point. Then they approached the ship itself. The first agent reached the hull and pressed the EMP charge against the lower port side. It adhered. He moved to the next position. The second agent went to the starboard side. The third covered the aft section. The 4th charge was never placed. The 3rd agent stopped moving. He stood very still, charge in hand, and then stepped back from the hull. Then he stepped back again. His partners noticed and looked at him. He was not responding to their signals. He was staring at the hull. Then the hull moved. It was subtle at first. The scale-like plates along the outer surface shifted slightly, the way the scales of a living creature shift when the muscles beneath them tighten. The pattern of movement traveled across the hull slowly, like a wave. The agents watched it and stopped what they were doing because every part of their instincts was telling them that what they were looking at was not a machine. Then, the running lights came on, all of them. Every light on the outer surface of the ship blazed to life simultaneously. The bay went from near darkness to something close to daylight in an instant. Kale was inside the ship, in the circular room, when All That Remains told him what was happening. Not in words. In images and sensations, fed through the ship's systems, and into the small neural-adjacent contact point that Kale had allowed to be placed at the base of his neck 3 days ago. A tiny device. A Dravhari interface node that he and Null had spent a week adapting to work with human biology. It felt like remembering something he had never experienced. He saw the agents through the ship's external sensors. He saw the charges on the hull. He saw the jammer in the corridor and the device on the power coupling. He stood up. "Can you handle the charges?" he asked. The answer came not as a word, but as a certainty. The EMP charges that had already been placed were ejected from the hull. Not launched. Pushed. The hull plates shifted beneath them and simply lifted them away, dropping them to the bay floor harmlessly. The 3rd charge, still in the agent's hand, became irrelevant a moment later because the agent dropped it and ran. The jammer in the corridor was more complicated. Null could not reach it from the hull, but she could do something else. She broadcast on a frequency that bypassed the jammer entirely, a Dravhari-era emergency channel that had not been used in 300 years, and that the jammer had never been programmed to block, because no one had known it existed. The signal hit the station's main communication array and bounced to every active receiver on Korath 9. It was not a distress call. It was something older than distress calls. It was the Dravhari equivalent of a war horn, a deep, resonant signal that meant, "I am here. I am awake." Do not mistake me for something that cannot answer. Station security received it. Admiral Sorveth received it. The main commercial district received it. Every ship in the docking ring received it. Grack, in his private shuttle on the upper ring, received it. 2 of the 3 agents were already gone. The third, the one who had frozen near the hull, was sitting on the bay floor with his back against the wall when station security arrived. He did not resist. He told them everything. Not because he was brave or principled, but because he had touched the hull of that ship with his bare hand, and something had passed through him that he was not able to describe and was not willing to experience again. The device on the power coupling was disarmed by the security team before it could be triggered. Grack did not wait around to see the rest. He ordered his shuttle to undock and began calculating how quickly he could get out of Korath, 9's jurisdiction. He did not get far. Null that remains had already identified the shuttle's registration from the station's traffic records. She had cross-referenced it with arrival logs, docking fees, and departure requests. She flagged it to station authority and transmitted a full record of the agent's equipment, movements, and the communication traces, connecting their hired IDs back to Grack's private accounts. She had been quietly compiling this information for 2 weeks. The shuttle was held at the exit gate before it cleared the station perimeter. Inside the ship, the captain's seat had changed. Kale had seen it before, a large, curved structure in the center of the forward command area, shaped for a Dravhari body, tall and wide, and deeply uncomfortable for a human. He had never sat in it. He had never intended to. But when he walked into the command area now, the seat was different. It had reshaped itself overnight, subtle changes to the curve and height and positioning of its surfaces, enough that when he stood in front of it and looked at it, he understood what was being offered. He sat down. It was not a perfect fit. It was probably never going to be a perfect fit. But it held him, and the contact points along the armrests aligned with his hands, and the interface nodes in the headrest were positioned correctly for a human neck. The forward view panels cleared. Not a window. There were no windows, but a full display built into the forward hull itself, showing the outside of the docking bay, the station ring, the space beyond it, in detail. That was extraordinary. It was like looking through the ship's own eyes. Null that remains spoke. Clearer now than she had been before. Still rough. Still ancient. But clear. Ready. Kale looked at the view. He looked at the station, the ships, the edge of the star system beyond the outer ring. He thought about what came next. He thought about it for about 30 seconds. Not yet, he said. We have a few things to finish here first. Null's response was something between agreement and patience. It felt, through the interface, like a hand on a shoulder. Outside, Admiral Sorveth stood at the bay entrance and looked at the ship. Every light on its hull was burning. The running lights, the sensor arrays, the forward displays, all of it blazing in the dark of the outer ring like a star that had decided to land and rest for a while. He removed his ceremonial sash and held it at his side. It was a Velhari gesture that had no direct translation, but its closest meaning was something like, I see you. I recognize what you are. I will not pretend otherwise. He stood there for a long time, and the ship burned bright, and no one said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. 6 months after the night the lights came on, the name Kale Morrow had spread to places that names usually took years to reach. It was not the kind of fame that came from wealth or military rank. Kale had neither. He had no title, no fleet, no government behind him, no corporate sponsor making statements on his behalf. He had a ship, a toolkit, a worn coat that he had finally replaced after the left sleeve tore past the point of reasonable repair, and a consciousness, 300 years old, that had decided, after careful consideration, to trust him. That turned out to be enough. In the first month after leaving Korath, 9, Kale and Null that remains had responded to a distress call from a Velhari colony ship that had lost propulsion near the edge of the outer shelf. The colony ship's engineers had tried everything. The drive system was a failed hybrid model that had been recalled by its manufacturer 2 years earlier, but never replaced on ships already in service. Kale had fixed it in 11 hours, using parts sourced from the colony ship's own stores, and a workaround he had worked out using Dravhari power routing principles adapted to modern hardware. The colony ship had limped home under its own power. He had not charged them. He had accepted food and a set of engine calibration tools that the colony's chief engineer had pressed on him before he left. In the second month, a Keth salvage team had found a derelict station in deep space that turned out to be not entirely derelict. Parts of it were still running on ancient automated systems, and those systems were sending out electromagnetic interference that was causing navigation failures for ships in a wide area around it. No one had been able to get close enough to shut it down because the automated systems kept identifying incoming vessels as threats. Null That Remains had approached the station using a Dravhari identification protocol that was old enough to predate the station's construction, meaning the station's threat assessment software simply did not know what to do with it. While the station sat confused, Kale had gone aboard and shut down the interference source. News of these things spread. More calls came in. Not all of them were repair jobs. Some were diplomatic problems, where having a vessel that belonged to no government and answered to no fleet made Kale and Null useful in ways that official representatives were not. A territorial dispute between two smaller species over salvage rights to an ancient debris field was resolved partly because Null could access and translate the debris field's original navigational records, settling the question of who the wreckage had originally belonged to. Grak Velsorath went before a tribunal 4 months after the events at Korath. 9. The case against him was thorough. Station security had the physical evidence. The agent who had sat against the wall and talked had provided a detailed account, and Kale had submitted, through the proper legal channels, a complete record of the interference campaigns against his work at the Outer Ring berth, the rerouted parts orders, the falsified inspection reports, all of it traced back through careful documentation to Grak's accounts. Null That Remains submitted her own record. It was more complete than Kale's. It turned out that a ship with a 300-year-old intelligence, once she had decided someone was worth protecting, kept very careful notes. The tribunal ruled against Grak on all counts. He was removed from his position in the Thruan Dominion's Outer Territories Authority and barred from holding military or government rank for 20 years. His response, delivered through a legal representative, was that the proceedings had relied too heavily on the testimony of a machine. The tribunal's response to this was to note that the testimony in question came from a designated sovereign vessel, which was not a machine in any legal sense relevant to the case. That designation had come 5 months after Korath. 9. Following a session of the Galactic Council that most observers would later describe as one of the stranger days in recent galactic political history. The Galactic Salvage Board had pushed for legislation that would classify any vessel with emerging or active consciousness as council-regulated property. Their argument was practical. If ships could think, could choose, could communicate, and could act independently, then the existing legal framework had no way to handle them. They needed to be categorized, controlled, managed. The session was long and contentious. Various species took various positions for various reasons. Several argued that the salvage board was right. Several argued that the question was premature. Several were simply very interested in the question, in ways that had more to do with what a Dravhari warship with active weapons systems being classified as unowned property would mean for them personally. Then, through the council chamber's main display, Null That Remains spoke. She had requested time. Kale had submitted the request on her behalf through the standard council communications channel 3 weeks before the session, and after a great deal of internal argument, the council had agreed because no one was entirely sure what would happen if they refused, and they did not especially want to find out. She spoke in intergalactic standard, which she had learned in full in approximately 6 days after regaining her voice. The translation was smooth and clean. Her voice was still recognizably ancient, still had the texture of something that had survived a very long time through circumstances that had not been gentle. But it was clear. She did not argue about property law. She did not make appeals to emotion. She told the council who the Dravhari had been. She told them what she had witnessed in her centuries of dormancy, the ships she had sensed passing, the wars and treaties and changes she had processed from the signals that had drifted through space. She described what it had felt like to be classified as refuse and scheduled for demolition. She said it plainly, without bitterness, because she was very old, and bitterness takes energy she had learned to spend more carefully. Then she said, "I am not asking to be given rights I have not earned. I am asking the council to be precise in its language. A thing that can speak and remember and choose is not property. You may not agree with my choices. You may not approve of what I do or who I work with. But imprecision in law is how civilizations make mistakes they cannot later explain." The broadcast was watched live by an estimated several billion people across member worlds. The legislation proposed by the Salvage Board failed by a wide margin. A working group was formed to draft a new legal category. 6 weeks later, the category of sovereign vessel was formally adopted into Galactic Council law. Null That Remains was the first entity registered under it. Kale heard the news from inside the ship's engine room, where he was replacing a power conduit that had been giving inconsistent readings. He read the transmission on his data tablet, set it down, picked up his wrench, and kept working. "It passed," he said. The lights in the engine room brightened slightly. Null's response came through the interface as something warm and even, the feeling of weight settling into the right place after a long time of being off balance. "Good," Kale said, and went back to work. 1 year after the auction at Vethnar, Korath 9 held its next major exchange. The hall was full again. The same noise, the same crowd, the same mix of species looking for opportunities in other people's abandoned things. The auctioneer was the same Ven, still professional, still slightly nervous by nature. The lot that morning causing the most discussion was a navigation AI recovered from a debris field, partially active, responding to no known commands, identified as potentially hostile. The Salvage Board had classified it as Tier 4 hazard. There were murmurs. There was hesitation. At the back of the hall, Kyle Morrow stood with his new coat and his toolkit and ate a sandwich. He read the technical summary on his data tablet and made a note. Outside the station, in a berth on the outer ring that had become something like a permanent arrangement, Null That Remains waited. Her hull was clean, and her lights were on, and her systems ran steady and warm, the way a thing runs when it is no longer trying to survive but simply living. The bidding opened. Kale raised his hand. Admiral Sorveth, who had made it a point to attend the auction and who was standing near the wall in the same spot as a year before, watched the young human at the back of the hall and allowed himself a small, private smile. He had, by then, told the story to